In this lesson, we'll cover work sharing. So you may say, well, what is work sharing? Let's look at this model for example. We have a lot of different things going on. There's mechanical systems, HVAC, electrical, plumbing. You also have structural elements, your floors, beams, columns, and obviously the architectural details, the walls, the doors, the windows, the furniture. So is it all created by one individual or do multiple individuals contribute to the project? I guess that's a question depending upon the firm or your company that you work at. So let's say multiple people are adding or contributing to this overall project. How do they go about entering that information in? Do you pass around the Revit file person to person to person? Or does each person have a copy of the file that then at the end you just kind of mesh it all together? Well, that's one method. Another method is work sharing. And what's meant by that is there's a central file created. And then all of the users, contributors, whoever are working on their individual piece, create their pieces on their local copy of the central file. And as they add, that information is synchronized to the main copy or central file. That central file then synchronizes everything down to everyone else. So the users are always up to date with what all the other users are adding to this central file. When you create the central file, well, you can do it first when you create the template, or you can create it anytime after the design has been started. But again, you need to create the central file first. So how do we go about creating the central file? Well, it's all done on the Collaborate tab within Revit. So click Collaborate, and once the tab appears, you have a variety of controls that'll actually control this central file and your local copy of the central file once it's created. So the first thing we need to do in creating the central file is define what's called a work set. Go ahead and click Work Sets on the left. By default, it's going to tell you to make the first work set based upon the shared levels and grids within your model. Go ahead and click OK. Now, what Revit will do is it'll read all of the levels, all of the grids within this model, and start to actually build that work set. From there, it's going to ask you to define additional work sets. And you may say, well, what's a work set and how do I define that? Well, think of it this way. What are the users that need to contribute to the project? Is there a person building the HVAC system? Is there another person building the electrical system? Another person still doing the plumbing? What about the architect or architects working on the walls, doors, and windows? Or the structural engineers calculating loads for floors and beams and columns? So these could all be individuals that are actually contributing to the actual project. So they would have a work set defined to them specifically for the area of what they're working on. Now, if you have less people in your firm, maybe you make a work set just for MEP, or just for structure, or just for architectural elements. Or if you have a lot of individuals and you want to make this more finite, maybe you have a more defined work set, such as one for, again, piping, plumbing, maybe doors, maybe a work set for windows, maybe a work set for fire alarms, or even a work set for lighting and power. So again, it depends upon the firm that you work at or your company as to what you create within your work set. So when the work set window appears, here's the work sets that were created by default, the shared levels in work set 1. And we need to create additional work sets. And for this example, we'll just name a few based on what we just discussed. So to create a new work set, click New in the upper right. And I'm going to call a work set in this example HVAC. Click OK. I'll create another work set and I'll call it plumbing in this example. Again, click OK. And maybe I'll create another work set and call it electrical in this example. And again, these can be whatever you choose. They could be as descriptive as this or less descriptive. You can make a work set just for MEP. And of course, I can add a work set for architectural details like doors, windows, other components, again, depending on what you want. Now, looking at these columns, the column that reads editable basically just means that an owner or a user can take ownership of that work set. And what this means is this, and this can help you define a work set. If me as a user checks out or takes ownership of the HVAC work set, that means I'm the only one that can modify anything in that HVAC work set, meaning all the HVAC components. Everyone else can see it, but they can't modify it. So depending on that answer to that question, you may want to just create a work set for MEP or maybe HVAC or specifically ducts and other elements of the HVAC system. Again, depending on how many people need to work on it. Owner is the owner, who it is. Borrow is if you're borrowing it. And opened is open. And invisible is when visible within the views. And again, I can edit this at any point moving forward. Once you've added these, simply click OK. This will create those work set elements. And I'll see that in the dropdown in the work set area. Here's the actual work sets we created. Revit also placed a work set dropdown on the very bottom of your screen, so you don't have to continually come back to the Collaborate tab to switch work sets. So this sets up the work sets. The next step is to save this as a central file. And to do that, it's just a matter of going to the large R, Save As, Project, and then defining this as a project name. In this case, I'm going to call this Central File. Now, there's already one in this actual example called Central File 1901 for this lesson. Don't rename that because that file is used in subsequent lessons. So for this here, I'm just going to call this Central File and then click Save. Again, save it where your chapter settings are at for this lesson. Also, on my screen, notice that there's a folder created for that other central file, the 1901 backup. So when you create this central file, there will be a central file backup folder created as well. So I click Save. The central file is being published to the directory where you chose this to be set. The work sets are created, and we're almost ready to go. The last step that you want to do is relinquish anything that you had ownership of since you created the work sets. So this would be the Relinquish All Mine icon on the Collaborate tab. This will basically give up ownership if you owned anything. I'll just verify I synchronized all of my changes back to the server. So I'll just say Synchronize Now from the Synchronize dropdown. This will push everything back to the workset file itself. And at this point, I've created that central file for within my workset. So as a review, in this lesson, we covered work sharing. We talked about what is work sharing and how does it work. Well, work sharing is the way to create a central file that all users can synchronize changes to that central file while working on their local copy of this project. The central file can be divided into work sets based on function or discipline of what the users do, such as mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, or more specifically, HVAC, electrical, piping, tubing, or architectural elements, doors, windows, and walls. And lastly, we looked at creating the actual central file and then relinquishing all control of any work set you currently had, and then synchronizing those changes back to the central file.